I'd like to begin the first in a series of essentially masterclass parts of how to deal with cardiac arrest. And I will tell you, this is not ACLS. This is not like anti-ACLS. This is stuff that you could do in addition or maybe better ACLS. So the same thing that you've been taught previously, but I want to kind of get into the finer points of it. How do you become a master resuscitator? That's the stuff that I want to talk about today. So, or at least start on that. We'll do this as a recurring series, but we'll hit with the first little bit of it today. So, the first thing I want to talk about, if you do more chest compressions during CPR, people tend to do better. This is a curve sort of showing that if you get your chest compression fraction, the percentage of time that you are above, that you are doing chest compressions when you're supposed to be doing chest compressions, if you get that above 60 and preferably 80%, people do better. People survive more. And you can see this based on this thing. And if you're not doing a lot of CPR, then they don't as well. And you may say, well, of course we're going to do chest compressions all the time. That's what we do in CPR. Compress airway breathing, right? That is CAB. The problem is that we've got this big built-in section here where we are not going to do CPR. And it looks something like this. So you see these guys doing CPR. We're doing compressions. Looks okay. All kind of standard. Everything good. Until somebody says pulse check. And then what happens when somebody says pulse check? Everything stops. The patient stops getting CPR. And they will continue to not get chest compressions and continue to, essentially this is going to be like 10 chest compressions, which is ineffective to really move any blood. Until this guy gets actual chest compressions again, it's going to be something like 20 seconds. And that's a long time for somebody to go without a heartbeat. You can imagine, just based on practicality, like if your heart is beating more often than not, then that's better. But if you stop for 20 seconds at a time, every couple of minutes, that person goes back into essentially back into no-flow cardiac arrest state instead of at least a little bit of flow with it. The pulse check is a dangerous time for us, and that was 21 seconds that I showed you there before the person got effective chest compressions. The average amount of time when you really look at it is probably closer to about 22 seconds, and they get 22 seconds of no flow time, 22 seconds of repeat, just dead cardiac arrest, cardiac standstill every 2 minutes. And that's a long time, and that's essentially probably has something to do with why we don't survive very well. I think we can fix that. Folks have brought out, well, the time intervals actually make a difference. So this is a complex graph, but I will just draw your attention to the line that I just traced there. If you decrease the amount of time you spend in a pulse check, particularly before and after the shock, and each one is an independent predictor of how well you do, then you improve the chances the person's going to survive. So if you can decrease the amount of time that you spend standing around after the person gets a shock to the time they get back on CPR, then that independently predicts whether or not the person's going to survive. That's a big deal. The sort of rule that they've added onto this thing was that your odds ratio of survival decreases by like 20% every 5 seconds you spend in the pulse check. So every 5 seconds, boom, 20% less chance that you are going to survive ultimately. And survival is not great to start with. Again, even if in the best of scenarios, it's 30-35% for most of us. If you knock off another 20% every 5 seconds or so, and we spend 21 seconds on average doing a pulse check, then we've lost a lot of that time already. It should be fairly clear why that's important. This is, again, just another study that says why it's important to get back on the chest or to not interrupt compressions. This is the likelihood that your shock is going to be effective if your pulse check, if your pre-shock pause, the time from when you stop CPR to the time when you deliver the shock, this says that if it's under 10 seconds, you got like a 95% chance of getting conversion, or at least the shock being successful, terminating VF or VT. And every couple more sets of seconds that it spends, that becomes less and less. So the earlier you can shock, the better. How do we fix our pulse check? There's some things that happen during CPR, and we can broadly group those into the 2 minutes of ACLS stuff, followed by the pulse checks every 2 minutes or so. And we sort of think of those as independently, but really it's all one big process. But we sort of treat it as, I'm going to do ACLS stuff in this center, and then there's going to be this pulse check thing that happens. What we probably need to do is kind of break that down, because there's a lot, we talk about all the ACLS stuff. That's basically everything that you do. That's why you spend like 2 days in an ACLS class, is to learn the ACLS stuff, but we sort of rarely talk about what actually goes on during the pulse check itself, at least in terms of like, this is a process and we need to break it out. Here's a list of all the stuff that happens during a pulse check. And you can see that there's a fair amount of it. There's probably close to as much stuff that has to happen in that little 10-second period as otherwise would have to happen in that whole 2-minute period before and after it. Again, depending on what it is that you're exactly doing. And all this has to happen pretty fast. Again, only about 5-10 seconds to make this happen, and we start hurting people relatively quickly after that. So what are the outcomes of the pulse check? You know, we sort of know what should be the outcome, what should be the goal of our chest compression, our 2 minutes of chest compressions. Well, it should be to do effective chest compressions, maybe give drugs, and then be ready for the pulse check. What should be the outcome? What should happen at the end of a pulse check? What are the only 2 things that realistically should happen? Well, the person should either get a shock or they should get more chest compressions. And at the end of a pulse check, it's all going to go to that. So we need to be driving to that as the goal. At the end of a pulse check, we need to have either given a shock or we need to be back on compressions, and that's the only 2 things that can happen at the end of it. And that's a binary decision. So don't sit around. You can pick one or the other. This really isn't something that we can sit around and think about for 30 seconds. Either shock the guy or get back on the chest. Here's how to sort of make that happen. Number one, we have to have a plan for this. There's no way that we cannot approach this without some sort of coordinated plan. We often talk about, they say pre-brief or decide ahead of time who's going to jump on the chest and who is going to do the airway. Do that as you're sitting in the cab of the ambulance driving up to the scene, but we don't really talk about like, what are we going to do during the pulse check? And that's kind of a shame because, it's going to happen every 2 minutes. It's probably, or close to 2 minutes. It's probably the only thing that is going to happen with regularity, and we got to have a plan for it. And we got to be able to say, well, I'm going to do this and you're going to do this. It's really, if I punch you in the face every 2 minutes, how much longer is it going to be a surprise? Like if I say I'm going to punch you in the face every 2 minutes, how long is it going to take you to just get out of the way when 2 minutes comes up? That's what sort of happens to us when we do these pulse checks. We sort of approach it as this is an independent thing and now I've done it, and we don't really do the preparation for it. So to use another video analogy, our preparation and our plan for the pulse check has to look something like this. This is a Formula 1 car. And this will take just a second. You see everybody lined up. They're ready ahead of time. Everybody's in their individual position. Car goes in. They change the tires. I don't think they adjust the stabilizer, but they change the tires, did a bunch of stuff, and all that happens in the course of like 4 seconds. Now, that's pretty cool, but that takes a lot of practice and a lot of training, but we can do that. Unfortunately, what we are kind of ending up with right now
to refuel and change tires.
Is something more like this.
Lou Moore himself changes the tires. Only 4 crew members, including the driver,
you see a bunch of guys
are allowed to work on the car.
Standing around. There's really only 2 or 3 people involved, but there's a bunch of people in the periphery. Somebody's hitting something with a hammer. The guy at the front, we don't really know what he's doing. The guy on the back seems to be mounting the subject for one reason or another. All that happens. And just because we're going to run short on time otherwise, this is sort of the way that our pulse checks tend to go. And EMS tends to be a little bit better than the folks in the hospital, but we'll say that everybody is guilty of the same thing. So now we're ready to go? No, we're not ready to get back on the chest. Somebody's going to go he's going to go hit the other tire with a hammer for a little bit as he tries to switch that out. We can do better than this, and with some practice and some time and some focused dedication on it, then we can get our pulse checks to look like that, like the Formula 1 car now versus this one in 53, 56, something like that. Just 67 seconds after he enters the pit. So a lot of this is going to be about how you organize the people around you. If you look at these guys are getting ready for a pulse check. There's a pulse check in about 15 seconds. And look at all these people like fiddle farting around here. Nobody's really paying attention. Nobody knows that there's 15 seconds until the pulse check is about to happen. There's folks, this is me over in the left-hand corner, kind of like fighting with people. Everybody's smiling and kind of joking around. We have no idea that this terribly dangerous thing is about to happen when we stop chest compressions, do this pulse check. We're going to stop this guy's heart for about 20 seconds to do this quote-unquote pulse check thing. And I don't think we appreciate that all the time. So here's the way that the things kind of lay out. You have a patient, yeah, and you have somebody doing chest compressions. Hopefully you have 2 people doing airway stuff. You probably have somebody doing drugs, and then you've got somebody with that little green box as the monitor, and then maybe you have an officer or a team leader carrying a clipboard, something along those lines. Now, if you add in that, there's usually other people around. Maybe they are well-meaning firefighters, or maybe they're PD, maybe it's family members, something like that. You got a couple other people kind of lined up in case you need something, and that's nice. But all of a sudden, this room starts to get awfully, awfully crowded. And we'll put this guy up here in the field because he's probably not at the foot of the bed. He's probably closer to the head just because that's where you get lined up. Okay, we got to figure out a way to corral all these people. And so the first step to that is that we've got to give you some warning. Again, our pulse check, it happens every 2 minutes, and we got to be ready every 2 minutes. Unfortunately, the way that we kind of approach it is thus. We start our 2 minutes of CPR, and here we go. CPR, CPR, chest compression, chest compression, chest compression, pulse check! Holy hell! I just always love that scene. And then we're all like, well, what happened? Again, it's coming every 2 minutes. Okay, I'm going to swing my arms in the air like this, and if your face gets in the way, it's your fault. Yeah, if you're not ready for a pulse check at the end of 2 minutes, then yes, there's nobody to blame but yourselves, but we got to have processes in place to let that happen. And so instead of just knowing when every 2 minutes happens, assuming that you're going by the 2-minute rule, don't just say, it's been 2 minutes, let's stop, and everybody just like kind of go away at that point. We got to tell people 30 seconds ahead of time. I think we need to tell them about 10 seconds ahead of time, and then we need to tell them when it is actually time to do it. To break that down. Again, 2 minutes of CPR starts and we're going cool. At 30 seconds toward the pulse check, we should be starting to put up a little bit of a warning light and say something's going on. It'll get a little bit more insistent when we get to 10 seconds, and then when it is time for the pulse check, we are going to eventually stop, but we got to do it in a little bit different way. At 30 seconds, at that 30-second mark, when somebody says, all right, it's 30 seconds till we're ready to do our next pulse check, or it's 30 seconds till we do a rhythm check, or whatever you want to call it in your service, what we should be thinking is, all right, everybody needs to get away from the patient who is not essential, and we need to identify the next person to do CPR. So clear all these folks out of the way 30 seconds ahead of time so that we don't have them all hanging around the patient when we actually get down to doing the rhythm check. And I'll show you why that's important in just a second. We're also going to move the next person into line, because if you've ever really watched your watch as people try to like shuffle around in a bedroom while they're doing CPR, it takes a long time to get the next chest compressor like up there ready if it's in a tight spot. So that person in about 30 seconds, we got to not only pick out who it is, but they got to start moving that direction. And exactly as I said, we identify the next person, and that person starts to get in position. Now, they're not going to take over CPR right now. They're just going to identify themselves. But this also gives us a heads up. Hey, we are about to do another pulse check here in just a minute, so everybody be ready. Now, at about 10 seconds, we need to be putting on the lights a little bit more and say, okay, we're actually going to do it this time. Get ready. In this case, we are going to get the next chest compressor in place, ready to go, and he's going to make a plan for the guy that's doing chest compressions right now to get out of the way. Whoever is going to be actually doing a pulse check with their fingers, assuming that that is a thing that you are going to do, they will get in a position, but don't touch the patient. Well, you can touch the patient if you want. You're going to let go in just a second. Again, I'll explain why. We need to go ahead and charge the defibrillator. We need to get everybody else off the patient who is not essential at this point. What does that look like? Again, here's where we just left it. At this point, our people have really cleared the patient. We've gotten everybody out of the way so that we know there's only 2 or 3 people that are going to touch the patient. And why do we get everybody out of the way? Well, because everybody is still somewhat nervous that somebody's going to touch the patient and they're going to get shocked when you fire the defibrillator. Now, it's probably not actually the case. That's probably not actually going to happen, and it's probably pretty safe, but we get everybody out of the way so that nobody is holding up, waiting for somebody to get their hand off the patient so that we can deliver the shock, because that in and of itself is a huge time waste and takes 5, 10, 20 seconds sometimes. Believe me, I've watched a lot of resuscitations in the last 5 years. I've seen it happen. The team leader needs to get himself in a position, if he is going to be the person that checks the pulse, he needs to get himself in a position where he's going to be able to touch the patient, but don't actually touch the patient. Again, I'll explain why in just a second. We need to pre-charge the defibrillator. As you are doing chest compressions, there is no reason that you can't go ahead and fire that thing up. Set it to 200 or whatever it is you're going to set it at, 360. If it's a kid, set it for whatever the weight-based dose is. and get ready, get that thing going. The defibrillator won't fire unless you push the button. So just don't push the button. Charge the thing up. It's not going to shock anybody. It's not going to send current through somebody there. And even if it did, it's, again, probably going to be just fine based on recent reports. Go ahead and charge that thing up. Because how long does it take to charge up the defibrillator? A long time. I'll get to it in just a second about exactly how long it takes. But charge that thing up so that when you stop chest compressions, all you have to do is push the button in order to get the shock to happen. Flash is too long. Okay. You review that one more time with feeling. At 10 seconds, and this is Walt's way of doing it, you don't have to do it this way, come up with your own by all means. But at 10 seconds, until we are going to do our pulse check, we've identified the next chest compressor, and he or she is in line behind the person, and make sure that the person that is doing chest compressions right now has some way to get away from the patient, because otherwise you're going to be stumbling all over yourselves, and it's going to be a big mess. So the next chest compressor makes a exit path for that person and is ready to go. We pre-charge the defibrillator. Again, how much time does it take to do a pulse check if you pre-charge the defibrillator versus not pre-charging the defibrillator? This has been looked at. So the whole thing probably takes, I believe the number was 18 seconds and significantly less hands-off time in the 30 seconds before and after the pulse check if you pre-charge the defibrillator. The bar on top is how long all the time intervals are if you don't pre-charge it, and at the bottom how long it takes if you do pre-charge it. So we're talking, 60% of the time, or at least a 30% reduction in time just by pre-charging that defibrillator. If you want to look at another way to kind of do it, if you haven't pre-charged the defibrillator ahead of time, I would recommend that you take a look at the way Seattle does it. And Seattle, everybody's got our own issues, but they do one thing really, really, really well, which is figure out this CPR thing. So they're doing a pulse check right now, and they have an AED. Now, he probably shouldn't have his hands on the patient while the AED is analyzing, but whatever. You'll kind of get the idea. Now, the defibrillator just said, okay, time to deliver a shock. Charging. Start CPR again. Okay? It takes 10 seconds to charge or something like that. This guy's going to keep on going past that 10 seconds, though. Why? Because he's going to deliver effective chest compressions for, there he goes, shock, and then jumps back on it. He's decreasing the amount of time that his hands are actually off the chest in between when when the shock is he stops, shock is delivered, and he's back on it. That took maybe a second or so to actually deliver the shock, which is essentially the same as having not stopped at all. That's pretty cool. And again, the reason that he's not stopping after like 10 seconds when the thing says that it's charged is because we need to deliver effective chest compressions. And effective chest compressions means you have to build up a pressure head ahead of time before you actually are getting any sort of perfusion to the brain or to any of your other organs. You have to do between 10 and 15 chest compressions. So he's going to do about 30 chest compressions, make sure that they were meaningful and that the person actually got some blood flow as the defibrillator is getting ready, and then stops, real quick shock, and then they're back on it. Real good use there. All right, now we're moving into the pulse check itself. Pulse check, we usually think of somebody says pulse check or 2 minutes, rhythm check, whatever you want to call it, and everybody just kind of stops and, kind of does this thing. Everybody leans back a little bit, or maybe somebody reaches their hand up on the patient. When you hear time for a pulse check, I would encourage you, don't stop chest compressions. That sounds counterintuitive. I'll explain it in a second. But also I would say don't reach out and touch the patient, which I will also get to. Do not stop chest compressions when somebody says time for pulse check, and do not reach out to touch the patient. Why? Well, what we should be doing is everybody getting away from the patient, because what is going to hold us up from either delivering the shock or doing chest compressions or analyzing the monitor? It's going to be somebody grabbing and wiggling on them. So when you hear pulse check, the guy giving the bag gives the guy doing the bagging gives a last squeeze, and then he and his partner, who's holding a two-hand seal, get away from the patient. All right, we've gotten almost everybody away from the patient at this point. The only person we have to worry about is the chest compressor. I just said don't stop chest compressions, though, when you hear pulse check. When you hear pulse check, use that as the signal that I need to, again, think about stopping soon. And the way that I recommend doing that is to say, all right, when you hear pulse check, the guy who is doing the chest compressions is in control. And whenever he stops is the time that we'll actually start that pulse check. So when you say pulse check, that's actually just a warning. And the guy doing the chest compressions will go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, pulse check. And when he gets to 10, or if he counts down from 10 to 0, or however you want to do it, that's the signal that we're actually going to do the rhythm check. It's that guy that's in control so that we have a continuous countdown so we know exactly what we should be doing. Now, what's everybody else going to do that time? We've already got the defibrillator pre-charged. We don't have to worry about that thing. The team leader themselves, or whoever is doing the actual rhythm analysis, needs to get themselves in a position where they're staring at the monitor and they are focused on this is either going to show a shockable rhythm or it's a not shockable rhythm, and I'm going to call it within about 2-3 seconds either way. Again, it's not that there's not that many choices that you really come up with. Either they are going to have something that can perfuse or they're going to have something that doesn't perfuse, and you just have to say whether it is or it isn't either way. As that first chest compressor gets out of the way, the next chest compressor needs to not be focused on checking a pulse, not be focused on looking at the monitor, and only focusing on getting himself into position to start doing chest compressions again. His job is not to do any of that other stuff. His job is to be the next one doing chest compressions. Again, the sign when you say pulse check, or when the leader or whoever's doing the timing calls out time for a pulse check, the guy that's doing chest compressions is the guy that becomes the boss, the actually head honcho, and determines when we're actually going to stop. And we don't stop until he stops. We don't get any of the other stuff ready until that guy stops. So we're going to give him full control of the scene at that point. When you hear pulse check, probably everybody else who is not doing chest compressions should put their hands in the air if you want to do that, or get the heck away from the patient. It doesn't have to be that dramatic, but you don't want the guy who is actually pushing the button on the monitor to have any concern that maybe somebody's checking the patient. He also shouldn't have to look up. He should just be able to look at the monitor and know that everybody else has gotten out of the way. So, here we are again. We've gotten our next chest compressor. Just to run through it one more time, we've got our next chest compressor in place. Somebody says pulse check. The guy doing the bagging gives one last squeeze and then gets away from the patient, doesn't look at anything else. It's not his job to look at the monitor. Gives a squeeze and he and his partner get away. The guy doing chest compressions, we'll take that as a signal. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and that's when the actual pause begins. The guy who is looking at the monitor is focused on the monitor at that point, and the guy who is running the monitor, if that's a different person, has his thumb on the button ready to go, and all they have to do, either the one person has to make the decision or somebody has to call shock or don't shock. And again, the guy watching the monitor really shouldn't have to look up at all to make sure that everybody's clear, because what does everybody do during a pulse check? You get your damn hands off the patient. The next guy doing chest compressions moves into position. And I will say one more thing. When you're doing this, let's get rid of the idea of a pulse check itself. Because nowhere in there did I say reach your hand out and feel on the carotid pulse for the person. What we should be doing, and even AHA, and that's years behind the good stuff usually, says don't do a pulse check, do a rhythm check. Why? Isn't that the same thing? No. Don't reach out and touch the patient. Reaching out and touching the patient is only going to delay the shock or make CPR harder. If you see this on the monitor during your pulse check, is that ever going to have a pulse associated with it? No. That's just not going to happen. How about this? Ever going to have a pulse associated with it? No, of course not. How about this? Maybe. Possibly. If it does, it's probably not a great idea to do a bunch of chest compressions on top of it. This is really the only time of those three when it might be beneficial to do a pulse check itself to see if there is a palpable pulse, although people argue about how effective your fingers are checking pulse. Anyway, nonetheless, asystole or VF doesn't need a pulse check. There's not a pulse associated with it. There can't be unless your monitor is malfunctioning, in which case you got other problems. But there's no reason to try to feel for a pulse that is not going to be there. If either of those is the case, you're just going to get in the way. So only if they have a rhythm that looks like it might be generating something that could perfuse heart and brain and kidneys, etc., then that's the time when you reach out and see if you can feel the pulse. I'll kind of jump over this one here. And by the way, who is the guy that actually gets to feel for the pulse? Maybe this guy. He doesn't really have another job at that point, because we see an organized rhythm. We wouldn't be checking the pulse unless it was an organized rhythm or something that didn't need a shock, because otherwise we're just going to shock him. I would say it's probably the guy that's operating the monitor. He should be the guy that actually feels for the pulse itself, which again keeps everybody else's hands off of the patient. He can't shock the patient and feel for a pulse at the same time. Probably. He could probably figure out a way to do it. But make the guy who is running the monitor, make him the guy or gal that actually checks the pulse as well. And that keeps, if you believe in the safety part of it, that keeps everybody safe, and then we're not going to fire the defibrillator with somebody touching the patient. Kind of jump over here. Yeah. By the way, our next chest compressor at this point has not looked at the monitor. He has not looked to see if it is a perfusing rhythm, and he does not have his hands looking for a pulse. He is getting ready to do chest compressions. All right. Very cool, huh? This may not work out exactly that way for you. And I've kind of gone into a little bit more detail than sometimes people want, but I want to run through it all one more time. This is the lover's way of doing the pulse check and the setup for the pulse check. That doesn't mean that it has to be your way. Look at what makes sense for your service, and you can adopt some of these principles, but let me kind of run through it one more time here just so that you see the whole thing end to end. So we've got a bunch of people fiddle-farting around this chest compression. We say it is 30 seconds until we are going to do a pulse check. At 30 seconds, everybody, let's see, good. Sorry, the thing keeps, every time it beeps, I'm worried something's going to happen. At 30 seconds until the pulse check, we say, all right, everybody get away from the patient if you don't have to be here. Drugs, we don't need you right now. Next chest compressor, get ready. Everybody else who might someday do chest compressions, get the heck away. And that guy starts to move into position. At 10 seconds to the pulse check, we get another warning. 10 seconds to rhythm check. What's going to happen at this point? Well, we really start pre-charging the defibrillator first, because that's going to take about 10 seconds to do. We get everybody else out of the way a little farther back, make sure nobody else is checking the patient, and the two guys that are getting ready to do the airway are also in position to move. And again, we've got the defibrillator pre-charged now. It's doing its beep thing. And we say, rhythm check. Okay, cool. Everybody who is not doing chest compressions or not operating the monitor, put your hands up in the air so that everybody knows that you're away from the person. Guys doing the bagging gets one more squeeze and then they get away. And the guy doing chest compressions, again, does some kind of countdown. I'm going to stop in 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now I've stopped. That guy doesn't look at the monitor. He doesn't look at anything else. He just gets out of the way so that the guy doing the monitor can deliver a shock without worrying about him being there. As he gets out of the way, the next person also doesn't look to feel a pulse or anything like that. He will just get up in position. The guy on the monitor is either going to shock the patient or he's going to check the pulse, but not both. And for God's sake, don't check the pulse after you deliver a shock. That's not the way that this works. This guy has moved into position. He's ready to do chest compressions. He, again, is not focused on the monitor or anything. He is focused on moving into position for chest compressions. How does that actually work out? Well, it looks something like this. Remember, our time before was about 21 seconds. And this is the same group of people, same situation. Obviously, it's a little bit staged, but this is to prove that it could actually work. One thing I would say is if I had it all to do again, I would probably have Amanda take off her badge. All right, there's our pulse check. Cody's in position, and he jumps right back on the chest. So the patient has gotten a shock. They've gotten the rhythm check. There was no pulse check to be done, and we switched out our chest compressors and our potentially our bagging team at the top. How long did that take? That took about 4 seconds. Again, this took a lot of drilling. This was like the 8th time that we practiced this before we actually got it down to about 4 seconds or so, just to make this part of the video. So this is not something that I'm expecting that everybody will be able to go out and implement tomorrow, but you can start implementing it tomorrow. You may not get the 2 or 3 second pulse check, but you can start it. You can certainly get it down from 20 seconds to 10 seconds. Or maybe 10 seconds to 8 seconds. And then from there, it's going to take more and more coordination as you get faster and faster. It's sort of like, folks that go on a big weight loss thing. The first, 20 pounds come off not too hard. After that, 20 pounds is something. After that, it becomes increasingly harder to lose the next 10. And then harder than that to lose the next 5. So it is going to take some work, and it's going to take a real effort for your service to come together and say, all right, here's what we're going to do, but we can do it if we put our mind to it and we start practicing on it. You do have to practice on it, and you have to practice in real time. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of at least a framework you might think about implementing when you're doing your pulse checks. But if nothing else, it hopefully brings attention to the idea that our pulse checks are too long, and the first thing we can do to start making CPR better is to decrease the length of those pulse checks. And it is within your power to do so with no additional equipment and really only a little process change.